But this is a long-term investment. I've always said from the get-go, even I started investing in cannabis 10 years ago, the exit and the liquidity event for cannabis is the end of prohibition and our ability to list these companies on US exchanges. And if you're looking for a return before that event, then cannabis investing is not for you.
My next guest is Michael Auerbach, founder of Subversive Capital. He's a board member of Atai Life Sciences and the parent company. Michael, welcome back.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's great to see you. And I love the fish in the background.
Thank you. Everybody loves the fish. Michael, you have quite a resume. You founded some of the largest companies. I believe you did the SPAC behind Compass Pathways.
Yeah, Compass didn't go into a SPAC, but we were definitely one of the seed investors. Compass went public, I guess now it's been over a year on the NASDAQ. And we're all eagerly awaiting the results of their psilocybin trial, which we should hear about in the coming months.
Yeah, George is a regular guest on our show because we cover as much of the psychedelic sector as we can. On your website, it's very interesting to me that you make the case that you are targeting industries that require a sophisticated regulatory strategy. And I guess that's all part and parcel of being first. So how is it that you have the ability to commit capital to something that might be perceived as so high risk that it requires a sophisticated regulatory strategy that may or may not materialize in your favor?
So I'm a commercial diplomat by trade. I still work for the Albright Stonebridge Group, which is Madeleine Albright, the former U.S. Secretary of State's consulting firm. And what we've been doing for large companies since the inception of the company is to help large Fortune 500 companies navigate regulatory regimes globally and government relations strategies globally, for the most part outside of the United States. It's not a lobbying firm. And so, back in 2013, when we made our first investment, my wife and I, we made our first investment in Privateer Holdings, which, was the largest, at the time, private equity capability dedicated to the cannabis industry. That's when I really started thinking about, there's a real need to create a venture platform that invests in companies that require some type of regulatory strategy for the success of the company. And, cannabis was a great example because it was the first time in our lifetime we'll see something go from illicit to licit. And all of the regulatory issues that are involved in bringing that product online, either through state or federal regulations, global regulations, the UN. And I just found it absolutely fascinating. And so from there, we grew, the platform into investing in the psychedelics industry, and the drone industry, and real money gaming, new types of metallurgy. We were really interested in anything that comes across the government's desk, and we wanted to do it the right way. And so, if you think about, I just had a lunch with a former Lyft executive, and, was commenting that, between Uber and Lyft, Lyft worked with governments and ended up in municipalities and ended up in more cities than Uber. Uber would go in and sort of break things and just assume that the government would go along. And Lyft took a different tack in life. And so, we're really interested in working with companies that, want to work with government as opposed to, companies that don't.
Right. Interesting. So one might say that following Subversive Capital's investments is following the future of certain emerging industries. How does a John Q investor participate in your vision?
Yeah, so it started off as a family office with my wife and I. We've grown, we've brought on some partners, and we've deployed a significant amount of outside capital. We do all of our investments as an SPV, so we're not sort of your traditional 2 and 20 fund. We do have eyes on either later this year or beginning of next year, most likely in Q1, of launching a standalone venture fund in the traditional sense. And taking outside capital and institutional capital. Right now, it's mostly high net worth individuals, family offices that I've developed relationships over the past 10 years.
Sure. I want to talk a bit about the parent company because one might make the case that it has not been kind to the later investors who participated in the post-go public strategy. And how does a investor sort of protect themselves against being that late to the party? You guys probably invest at a much earlier stage such that a decrease in share price from the go public strategy is not a loss for you, but in some cases for retail investors who follow you, it is. So what would you say to somebody who is an investor in the parent company about investing alongside your products in the future?
Yeah, so let me be careful with what I say because we're sort of coming towards the end of the quarter here.
Okay.
And I'm the chairman of the company. But what I will say is that, from approximately November, from the election of 2020 to March of 2021, a whole slew of new investors came into the industry, not just into the parent company, but into all of the sort of major U.S. plant-touching Canadian-listed cannabis names. We had hedge funds come in, large institutions and family offices, thinking that the election would precipitate regulatory change, which it will, but they thought it would be an accelerated regulatory adjustment, which it's not. Even I believe that we would see significant regulatory change before the end of this calendar year. I'm a little less bullish on that, although I still think there's a possibility that we'll get some legislative movement on the federal level before the end of the year. But it looks like this is really going to be a 2022 story as opposed to a 2021 story. And those new investors, two things happened to them. One is many of them lost custody issues with their prime brokers. And the other is that they just became impatient. And so there's been a big sell-off in the market. If you look at MSOS, the big ETF, they're down 30% on the year. Columbia Care is down 30% on the year. Glass House, which just de-SPACed a couple of months ago, is down 50% since their de-SPACing. We're down, I think, 60% since January. The stock price doesn't reflect the fundamentals of the company, not just our company, but all of the companies. And I think we're trading just above cash level at this point. And so it's a real opportunity for buyers. The problem is that the market that we're on in Canada, there's just not a lot of volume. And so the selling pressure, even if you want to sell 5,000 shares, it's going to affect the stock price negatively. And so it's just a difficult time. So what I would say to investors is, yes, it totally sucks if you bought at 10 and it's now trading at 3, or you bought at 12 and it's now trading at 3. But this is a long-term investment. I've always said from the get-go, even I started investing in cannabis 10 years ago, the exit and the liquidity event for cannabis is the end of prohibition and our ability to list these companies on U.S. exchanges. Sure. And if you're looking for a return before that event, then cannabis investing is not for you.
Right. It's not a day trade.
It's not a day trade.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's consistent with. So I actually recommended the transaction during when the SPAC went public, and it initially performed adequately. So it was a day trade for somebody who wanted to day trade it, swing trade it. But that's what I ended up telling my subscribers is that, and I too expected an accelerated integration of the policies that was sort of alluded to by the Biden-Harris administration. And, understandably, in retrospect, it's not their top priority after the last administration. So, yeah, just be patient, wait. Other company that is doing a lot better is Atai Life Sciences. And so, the thing that the consistent pattern that I'm seeing here, from Tilray to all of these things is that you've got a sort of a superior access to deal flow relative to a lot of different groups active in the emerging industries. So then, is it, are there other future industries that you guys are looking at, targeting, or sort of considering at this point?
Yeah, I mean, just on psychedelics for a second, we made 5 bets in the psychedelics industry, or 4 bets in the psychedelics industry, and then a ketamine play as well, which isn't a psychedelic. We're excited about our portfolio. We are sort of seeing a lot of companies, going public in Canada. It kind of reminds me of cannabis about 5-6 years ago, including some of the same players in cannabis are taking platforms public in Canada. I think we've chosen the most sophisticated companies, particularly Atai and Compass. But even Cybin and Field Trip are very formidable platforms. We like this industry a lot, but this is strictly biotech. I mean, this is FDA, EMA pathway, long-term drug development. We won't see a prescription drug other than the ketamine one by Johnson & Johnson. We won't see a prescription drug where your doctor will be able to prescribe it, in the next couple of years. So it's sort of long. It's a long tail traditional pharma play for this industry. That said, in thinking about your question around other things that we're looking at, one of the things we've spent a lot of time on over the past 9 months, particularly given COVID, and more, inspired from my 12-year-old son who, is in front of his screen all day long because he was primarily at home, is the metaverse. And so we're starting to really pay attention to some of the companies that will build not only build the infrastructure for the metaverse. And the metaverse is essentially, it's a terminology from science fiction. And I don't know if you've seen the movie Ready Player One, but Steven Spielberg sort of, memorialized it in Eric Klein's book Ready Player One in a film that came out a couple of years ago. But eventually, as our worlds have all moved online, eventually, this is going to be more virtual for us. And so, when you and I have this conversation, right now we're having this conversation through screens. In a few years, you and I will be having this conversation, in the same room. We just won't be in different cities. We will start to live in this more three-dimensional virtual space. And so what does that mean, and what are the companies that are building that infrastructure? Facebook has sort of taken the mantle and said, with Oculus that, they're pivoting to a 100% metaverse company. I don't think Facebook is the winner here in sort of developing that infrastructure. But there's lots of great tech companies out there. There's lots of great startups. Even, I've got a Peloton behind me. Like, Peloton's a perfect example of a metaverse company where, eventually I'll be riding my bike with my friend who lives in Germany in, the Italian Alps. And it will feel as if we are there next to each other in this location. And I'll be here in, downtown New York. Sure. So I'm excited about this for a number of reasons. I'm excited because I think it's a great investment. Is that me? I'm sorry. I think it's a great investment thesis. But I also believe that, going back to sort of our traditional focus on regulated industries, everything that goes along with what happens in sort of our sort of real world in terms of laws and behaviors and rules and privacy, we're going to have to create a whole new sense of sort of a regulatory environment for the behaviors of human behavior and nation state behavior as it relates to living in sort of this next version of the internet, which is the metaverse. And so we're spending a lot of time thinking about that and thinking about which companies we're interested in, and we'll be making some investments in the space in the coming months.
Interesting. I could talk to you all day, Michael, but we're running out of time here. And I have one final question. I've been approached recently by a group who is representing that they are going to create the first chain of psychedelic cafes. And they are sort of offering this projection that there is a psychedelic regime in the future not a psychedelic regime, but a recreational regime for psychedelics that, will ultimately become socialized. Is that consistent with what you believe?
Yes and no. So I believe that sort of similar to CBD, where it's now, everyone has access to it for medical purposes through the Farm Bill. But then you have GW Pharma, which has the prescription drug for the treatment of epilepsy and other indications covered by insurance, et cetera. So I do see that these municipalities like Oakland and Portland and now Seattle and some others, passing sort of not just decrim of psychedelics, but allowing access to things like psilocybin and other psychedelics for the treatment of mental health without going that prescription model. I do think that there's room for both of these verticals within psychedelics. The the issue with a sort of a psychedelic cafe is that's not really how people want to experience psychedelics. And so there's sort of the psychedelic party drug, which is, let's go to a rave and do psychedelics and enjoy, or, go and walk in the hills, et cetera. But really for the treatment of treatment-resistant depression and other mental health issues, you really need a guide. You really need somebody that's expert. And that's why a lot of people go on these retreats to places like, in Latin America and Central America and Europe, even places in the United States, where they're doing sort of high dosages of things like psilocybin, but they're doing it with a professional to be able to really understand what is happening with them as they sort of disaggregate their ego, and then they need to rebuild it with a therapist. So for it to really have an impactful state on your psyche and your mind, and your mental health trajectory, you really need. This isn't something that's going to be done in a coffee shop, sort of similar to Amsterdam or something like that, or in your basement, or with your friends. There will be a decriminalization movement. So I think what we sort of consider party drugs, I think people will have more access to that in a way that they don't have to worry about the legal ramifications of that. But I really do believe, I'm confident that, I'm sorry, I've got dogs in the background. I'm confident that that the majority of folks that want to use psychedelics like ibogaine and LSD and psilocybin will do so through a pharmaceutical approach, an approved drug, approved by the FDA or the EMA, insurance covered, and with a guide in some type of either estate, clinic, outdoor retreat. Field Trip is doing the ketamine clinics, which I think is a, sort of, if you think about it, like a meditation clinic, or, it's not just going to be in a doctor's office. It'll be something that will allow you to, experience this in a way that is going to be helpful to your mental health.
You bet. Michael, we're going to have to leave it there for now. I really appreciate your time, and I look forward to talking to you again in the future.
Yeah, me as well. Anytime.
You bet.
Have a great rest of the week.
Thanks, you too. Bye for now.